Princess Silera stood tall in the center of the grand diplomatic hall, her silver-blue robes flowing elegantly around her. The air smelled of polished metal and the faint scent of alien spices. She took a slow breath, keeping her expression calm. The future of her people depended on this meeting. The humans were unpredictable, dangerous, and completely unlike any other species in the galaxy. And today, she would meet one face to face. She had trained for this moment for years. The Valwraith Dominion, her people's mighty empire, had ruled vast territories for centuries. They were known for their intelligence, discipline, and refined culture. Humans, on the other hand, were the opposite, wild, chaotic, and impossible to control. The stories about them were disturbing. They were not the strongest species, nor the most advanced, yet somehow they survived. Worse, they won wars they had no right to win. Silara's golden eyes flickered toward the large steel doors as they slowly slid open. Her heart beat faster, but she showed no emotion. The human was here. Captain Daniel Carter stepped inside. Silara's first impression was unexpected. He was tall but not monstrous. His uniform was simple compared to the elaborate robes of the Valwraith, but it was sharp and well-fitted. His face was strong, with a scar near his right eyebrow, old but noticeable. His eyes, however, were the most unsettling. They were sharp, focused, but held an ease that made her uneasy. He did not look nervous. He did not look intimidated. He simply was. She had expected arrogance. She had expected aggression. Instead, he looked at her like an equal. Princess Silara, right? Carter's voice was deep but not harsh. He gave a small nod, his hands resting behind his back. Captain Daniel Carter, United Terran Coalition. It's an honor to meet you. His tone was casual. Too casual. Silara blinked. Her people believed in formality, in the proper way of speaking and moving. This human spoke as if they were old friends. She straightened her back, regaining control. "The honor is mine, Captain," she said smoothly. "I trust your journey was comfortable." "About as comfortable as a military transport can be," Carter replied with a slight grin. "Nothing like the fancy ships you guys have, I'm sure." Silara narrowed her eyes slightly. Was that humor? Was he mocking her? She had studied human behavior, but nothing had prepared her for this. He was not acting like a warrior. He was acting like someone at ease, as if this meeting didn't hold the weight of a fragile peace agreement. She refused to let him see her confusion. "Our ships are built for efficiency," she said, her voice steady. "I assume yours are built for war." Carter shrugged. "War, exploration, survival, whatever the job calls for." He tilted his head slightly, watching her. "You know, you don't have to keep looking at me like I'm about to bite. I promise, I'm house-trained." Silara froze. For the first time in years, she nearly lost her composure. Did he just compare himself to a pet? Was this some kind of strange human insult? Carter chuckled at her reaction. "Sorry, bad joke. I forget you guys don't do humor the way we do." She took a slow breath, willing herself to remain calm. This was a test, a psychological strategy to throw her off balance. She would not allow it to work. "Humor has its place," she said coolly. "But I assume you understand the seriousness of this meeting." "Of course." His grin faded slightly, replaced by a more professional expression. "We're here to make sure this alliance works. No one wants another war, Princess. Especially not us." She studied him carefully. His words sounded genuine, but humans were skilled deceivers. They had survived in this galaxy by adapting, by outsmarting stronger species. Could she trust him? A soft chime rang through the hall, signaling the arrival of the rest of the delegations. Silara exhaled quietly, keeping her emotions locked away. This was just the beginning. As she walked forward, leading the way to the conference room, she could feel Carter's presence beside her. Strong, steady, and completely impossible to ignore. Princess Silara walked ahead with slow, graceful steps, her every movement controlled and measured. The conference hall stretched before her, tall, metallic walls gleaming under the soft artificial lights. It was built as a neutral ground for both Val'Rith and human delegations, but to Xelara, it felt too sterile, too cold. Or perhaps it was just the human walking beside her that made her uneasy. Captain Daniel Carter moved differently than her kind. His steps were relaxed, his posture casual, yet there was something about him that radiated awareness. He wasn't careless. No, he was watching everything. Even though his stance was easy, she could see the trained discipline in his every motion. It was unsettling. He didn't behave like a warrior should. She had met warriors before. Val'Rith soldiers were disciplined, sharp, and quiet. They carried themselves with dignity, showing strength and stillness. Humans, however, were unpredictable. "So," Carter said, breaking the silence, "is this your first time meeting a human up close?" Xelara kept her gaze forward. "No," she replied smoothly. "I have studied your people extensively." "Studied, huh?" He let out a short laugh. "Like in books, or watching from a safe distance." Xelara's jaw tightened slightly. His tone, it was not disrespectful, yet it lacked the formal reverence she was used to. Did he not realize who she was, or did humans simply not care about royal status? She turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze. "I have observed humans during diplomatic events," she said, "and I have reviewed countless reports on your species. I know enough." Carter raised an eyebrow. "You think you know enough?" Xelara frowned. What was that supposed to mean? Before she could ask, the doors to the main conference room slid open. Inside, several high-ranking officials from both sides were already seated at the long metallic table. The air carried the weight of history. Two civilizations that had once been enemies now attempting peace. Xelara took her seat with careful poise, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Across from her, Carter sat down in a manner that almost seemed lazy, one arm resting on the table, his expression unreadable. The meeting began. For the next hour, representatives from both sides spoke, discussing trade routes, military boundaries, and mutual agreements. Xelara listened intently, answering when necessary, but her focus kept drifting to the human beside her. Carter barely spoke, yet his presence was impossible to ignore. He was not a politician. That much was clear. He did not engage in long-winded discussions or strategic wordplay. But every time someone mentioned military cooperation, his eyes sharpened. He was studying, analyzing, waiting. Then, finally, the discussion turned to security protocols. Both sides must agree on a joint protection force for high-ranking diplomats, one of the human officials stated. A balanced team of Val'Rith and human soldiers will ensure fair treatment. Xelara remained composed. Val'Rith soldiers are highly trained. We have the discipline and skill to protect our own. There is no need for human involvement in our security. Carter finally spoke. "With all due respect, Princess, you were nearly assassinated last year." The room fell silent. Xelara's fingers curled slightly against the table, but she kept her expression neutral. That matter was handled internally. Carter leaned forward slightly. "Handled or not, it proves that threats still exist. You may not trust us, but we know how to deal with danger. If this alliance is going to work, we need to rely on each other." Xelara inhaled slowly. This was why humans were dangerous. Not because of their weapons or their armies, but because of their boldness. They had no fear of speaking their minds, no hesitation in challenging authority. "I appreciate your concern, Captain," she said carefully, "but my people believe in self-reliance." Carter tilted his head. "And what happens when self-reliance isn't enough?" For a moment, Xelara had no response. The meeting continued, but a strange tension lingered between them. Carter had not spoken disrespectfully, yet his words unsettled her. Not because they were rude, but because they carried an uncomfortable truth. As the session ended, Xelara stood, smoothing out her robes. The other officials began to leave, but Carter remained in his seat, watching her. Just as she turned to go, he spoke again. "You don't like me much, do you?" Scilara froze for half a second before regaining control. She turned back to him, her golden eyes unreadable. "I do not know you, Captain." Carter smirked slightly. "Not yet." Scilara said nothing. Without another word, she walked out of the room. But even as she left, she could feel his presence in her mind. Strong, steady, and completely impossible to ignore. Princess Scilara walked down the long corridor of the diplomatic station, her thoughts troubled. The meeting had ended, but the human soldier's words still lingered in her mind. And what happens when self-reliance isn't enough? She exhaled quietly, trying to push the thought away. Humans were bold, too bold. Carter spoke as if he understood her world, as if he could challenge her beliefs so easily. It was frustrating. It was unsettling. But she had no time to dwell on it. The diplomatic mission was not over. There were still discussions to finalize, still agreements to secure. The fragile peace between their species depended on careful negotiation, not reckless emotions. The sound of footsteps behind her made her tense slightly. She didn't have to turn to know who it was. "Captain Daniel Carter." "Princess," he said, his tone neutral. Not too formal, not too casual. She glanced at him. "Captain." He walked beside her, matching her pace effortlessly. She found it irritating how comfortable he seemed around her, as if they were equals. Among her people, rank and status dictated everything. Yet this human acted as though such things did not concern him. "Long day," Carter remarked. "You holding up all right?" Scilara frowned slightly. "I do not require concern for my well-being." Carter smirked. "Didn't say you did. Just making conversation." Before she could respond, a sudden boom shook the station. The walls trembled, lights flickered, and alarms blared through the corridors. Sciara's heart jumped, but she forced herself to remain calm. A second explosion followed, shaking the floor beneath them. Carter's entire demeanor changed in an instant. The relaxed soldier was gone. Now, his stance was sharp, his eyes scanning the area with quick precision. His hand moved to his sidearm. "Stay close," he ordered. Scilara bristled. "I do not take orders from." Boom! Another explosion roared through the station. A force field barrier activated down the corridor, blocking their path to the main chamber. The station was under attack. Carter grabbed her arm and pulled her into a side passage before she could protest. His grip was firm but not rough. "Listen, Princess, this station's been compromised," he said, his voice low but urgent. "We don't have time to argue. We need to get you to safety." Scilara wanted to protest, to demand control of the situation, but even she could see the truth. The attackers, whoever they were, had planned this well. They had breached security, and they were coming for the highest-ranking officials. Her. She took a breath, steadying herself. "What do we do?" Carter gave her an approving nod. "We move. Now." He led the way through the corridor, his posture alert. Scilara followed, her senses heightened. Her long robes made movement difficult, but she refused to let them slow her down. Suddenly, voices echoed ahead. Armed figures in dark armor moved through the halls, scanning for targets. Carter pressed himself against the wall, motioning for Scilara to do the same. She obeyed, heart pounding. "Mercenaries," he muttered. "Not your people, not mine. Someone doesn't want this alliance to happen." Scilara frowned. "Then we must ensure it does." Carter grinned slightly. "That's the spirit." The mercenaries moved closer. Scilara tensed. She was not helpless. Her people were trained in self-defense. But she had never been in a situation like this before. Carter whispered, "When I say go, follow me. Stay low, stay behind me, and don't stop moving." Scilara nodded. Carter counted silently. 3, 2, 1, go. He moved like a predator, swift and precise. Scilara followed, her heart hammering. The mercenaries barely had time to react before Carter struck. He took down the first with a silent takedown, grabbing the enemy's weapon as he fell. The second turned, but Carter fired first. A clean, efficient shot. Zilara watched, both impressed and unsettled. Humans were deadly, but there was no hesitation in his movements. He fought not for pleasure, not for dominance, but for survival. "Keep moving," he urged. They ran through the station, dodging patrols, using side routes to avoid detection. Each moment stretched endlessly, the air thick with tension. Finally, they reached a secure maintenance tunnel. Carter shut the door behind them and exhaled. "That buys us time." Zilara steadied her breathing. "You are effective." Carter gave her a lopsided grin. "Glad you noticed." She looked at him, truly looked at him. He was human, yes, wild, unpredictable, and completely different from her kind. But in this moment, he was the only thing standing between her and death. For the first time since meeting him, she felt something unexpected. Trust. But she would not say it aloud. Not yet. Carter checked his weapon. "All right, princess. Let's get you out of here." Zilara nodded. The mission had changed. This was no longer just about diplomacy. It was about survival. The cold metal walls of the maintenance tunnel seemed to close in around Princess Zilara. The hum of emergency power filled the air, flickering lights casting long shadows. The station was still under attack, and now she was trapped in a narrow passageway, alone with a human soldier. Captain Carter moved ahead, his steps careful, his weapon ready. He scanned every corner before moving forward. His training was clear in his every motion. He was built for survival. Zilara, on the other hand, was built for diplomacy. She was used to controlling conversations, navigating political games, not running through dark tunnels with explosions shaking the station around her. She kept up with Carter, her golden eyes sharp. "Where are we going?" "Secondary hangar," he replied without looking back. "Your transport should still be intact. If we get there fast, we can escape before the mercs lock down the exits." "And what about the others?" she asked. Carter hesitated for only a moment before saying, "Right now, you're their priority target. If we get you out, the station forces can handle the rest." Zilara didn't like the answer, but she knew it was logical. Still, something about Carter's attitude bothered her. He was too calm, too controlled, even in the middle of chaos. Did humans feel fear at all? Another explosion rocked the station. The tunnel walls trembled. A metal beam fell from above, crashing to the floor between them. Smoke and dust filled the air. Carter cursed under his breath, quickly stepping forward to check the damage. Zilara coughed, waving a hand to clear the dust. The path ahead was blocked. "Well," Carter muttered, "that's not good." Zilara frowned. There must be another way. Carter glanced at the walls, then turned toward a service hatch on the side. He knelt, gripping the handle. It was jammed. He tried again, his muscles tensing, but the hatch refused to move. Zilara sighed. "Allow me." She stepped forward and placed a hand on the control panel beside the hatch. A faint glow of energy pulsed from her fingertips as she activated her neural interface. The hatch made a low clicking sound, then slid open. Carter raised an eyebrow. "Handy trick." Zilara gave him a small, proud look. "Unlike humans, my people prefer intelligence over brute force." Carter chuckled. "Hey, brute force works just fine." She ignored his remark and stepped through the hatch. The passage beyond was smaller, darker, and barely wide enough for them to move side by side. "This leads to the lower service corridors," she said. "It will take longer, but it's the only way." Carter nodded. "Then let's go." They moved quickly, their footsteps echoing in the narrow space. The air was tense, thick with unspoken words. After a few minutes, Carter spoke. "You've never been in a real fight before, have you?" Zilara stiffened. "I have trained in combat." "That's not what I asked." She glared at him. "No, I have not." Carter nodded as if he had expected that answer. "Thought so." Scifi felt frustration rise inside her. "Does that make me weak in your eyes?" Carter glanced at her. "No, just inexperienced." His tone wasn't mocking. It was simply a fact. Scifi narrowed her eyes. "And you seem unaffected by all this. The danger, the explosions, the possibility of death. Do humans lack fear?" Carter smirked slightly. "Oh, we feel fear. We just don't let it stop us." Scifi studied him. There was something about the way he said it, something deeper, something she couldn't quite understand. Humans were strange creatures. Suddenly, a metallic clang echoed through the passage. They both froze. Carter held up a hand. "Wait." Scifi held her breath. Then, footsteps. Someone was in the tunnel with them. Carter pressed himself against the wall, motioning for Scifi to do the same. Slowly, he peeked around the corner. 2 mercenaries, heavily armed, searching. Carter pulled back, whispering, "They're blocking the way forward." Scifi's heart pounded. "We cannot turn back." Carter nodded. "Then we need a plan." She watched as he checked his weapon, his face calm, calculating. There was no hesitation in him. Humans truly were built differently. For the first time, she wondered, was that a strength or something to fear? Either way, she was about to find out. Scifi pressed her back against the cold metal wall, her breath controlled, but her heart pounding. Just ahead, 2 mercenaries stood in the passageway, their weapons ready, their movements sharp and precise. They were searching, hunting. Beside her, Captain Carter remained perfectly still, listening. His expression didn't change, his breathing steady. He was thinking, calculating. Finally, he whispered, "All right, Princess. We need to deal with them fast and quiet." Scifi frowned. "There are 2 of them. You cannot take both at once." Carter gave her a quick smirk. "I can if you help." She blinked. "Me?" He nodded. "I need a distraction. Just a small one. I'll handle the rest." Scifi hesitated. She was no warrior. Her battles were fought with words, not weapons. But there was no choice. If they failed here, they wouldn't reach the hangar. Taking a deep breath, she steadied herself. "What do I do?" Carter pointed toward a loose metal pipe near the ground. "Kick that. Hard. Then stay back." She swallowed her pride and did as he said. With a quick, sharp movement, she kicked the pipe. It clattered loudly against the floor. The mercenaries spun toward the sound, weapons raised. Carter moved. Fast. Silent. Before the first mercenary could react, Carter grabbed him from behind, twisting his arm and forcing his weapon down. A quick, precise strike to the back of the head, and the man collapsed without a sound. The second mercenary turned, eyes widening, but Carter was already on him. A swift, powerful punch to the jaw, followed by a kick that sent him crashing into the wall. The mercenary groaned, trying to raise his weapon, but Carter grabbed it and slammed the butt of the rifle against his head. The man slumped to the ground. It was over in seconds. Scifi stood frozen. Carter exhaled, rolling his shoulders. That went well. Scifi's eyes flickered between the unconscious bodies and the human standing in front of her. "You are terrifying." Carter chuckled. "I get that a lot." Scifi was not joking. She had seen warriors fight before, but never like this. Rith soldiers fought with elegance, using strategy and energy-based combat. Carter fought like a storm, fast, brutal, and unstoppable. He checked the mercenaries' weapons, tossing one aside, and keeping the other. "We need to move before more show up." Scifi forced herself to focus. Agreed. They stepped over the fallen enemies and continued through the passage. As they moved, Scifi found herself watching Carter more closely. She had thought humans were reckless, but now she realized something else. They adapted. Carter didn't just fight with strength. He fought with instinct, reading his enemies, adjusting in the moment. She was beginning to understand why humans had survived so many wars. They reached the end of the corridor. A heavy security door blocked the way, but a terminal sat to the side. Scifi stepped forward, placing her hand on the interface. The screen flickered, access denied. She frowned. They have locked down the system. Carter sighed. Figures. Can you override it? Scifi's fingers moved across the controls. I can try, but it will take time. Carter nodded. Do it. I'll cover you. As she worked, Carter positioned himself near the door, keeping watch. The station was too quiet now, and that made him uneasy. Scifi focused, channeling her neural connection into the terminal. She could feel the security layers, the digital barriers blocking access. She pushed harder, bypassing the lower defenses. The lock clicked. She turned to Carter. It's done. Carter gave a small nod of approval. Nice work, Princess. She ignored the strange feeling his praise gave her. The door slid open, revealing a larger corridor. In the distance, the sound of engines hummed. The hangar was close. Scifi exhaled. We are almost there. Carter stepped through first, scanning the area. Then let's not slow down. But just as they moved forward, a voice echoed behind them. Going somewhere. They spun around. A new mercenary stood at the entrance, different from the others. His armor was heavier, his stance confident, and in his hand he held a high-powered energy rifle, aimed directly at Scifi. Carter immediately raised his own weapon, but the mercenary smirked. Ah. Lower that, soldier, the man said, unless you want the princess to be our next casualty. Scifi stiffened. Her heart pounded, but she kept her expression calm. She could not show weakness now. Carter, however, didn't move. His fingers tightened on his weapon, his jaw clenched. Scifi could see it in his eyes. He was calculating the distance, the angles, the risks. He was looking for a way out. And somehow, she knew he would find one. Scifi stood frozen. The cold barrel of the mercenary's energy rifle aimed directly at her. The air was thick with tension, the hum of distant engines the only sound in the quiet corridor. Carter, standing beside her, hadn't moved. But she could see it, his sharp eyes scanning, his muscles tensed, his mind calculating every possible move. The mercenary smirked. Smart man. You know when you're outmatched. Carter tilted his head slightly. If I was smart, I wouldn't be here. The mercenary chuckled. Fair point. He shifted his grip on the rifle. Now here's how this is going to go. The princess comes with me, and you walk away. Maybe you get to live, maybe you don't. Not my problem. Scifi clenched her fists. She was not some fragile thing to be taken as a prize. Carter exhaled slowly. That's not happening. The mercenary sighed. I figured you'd say that. Without warning, Carter moved. Fast. Scifi barely had time to react before everything happened at once. Carter's weapon fired, not at the mercenary, but at the lights above. The shot shattered the power relay, plunging the corridor into darkness. Scifi heard the mercenary curse, then a struggle, grunts, a scuffle of boots against the floor. Then, a gunshot. Silence followed. Scifi's heart pounded. She forced herself to remain calm, to focus. A moment later, dim emergency lights flickered to life, casting long shadows against the walls. And there stood Carter, breathing hard, weapon raised. At his feet, the mercenary lay motionless. Carter exhaled and turned to her. You okay? Scifi nodded, though her pulse was still racing. You took a risk. Carter shrugged. Calculated risk. She narrowed her eyes. And if your calculations had been wrong? He smirked. Then I'd be the one on the floor. Scifi shook her head. Humans. They truly had no fear. But there was no time to argue. The station was still under attack. The longer they stayed, the greater the danger. Carter reloaded his weapon. Come on, we're almost there. They moved quickly through the corridor. The hum of the hangar's engines grew louder. As they reached the final door, Carter stopped. Stay behind me. Scifi frowned. I can fight. I know it, he said, but let me handle this one. Before she could protest, he pressed the door control. The hangar opened before them. Chaos. Mercenaries filled the space, patrolling the area, securing ships, locking down exits. Carter muttered a curse. They got here first. Scifi scanned the hangar. Among the ships, she spotted hers, her personal diplomatic transport. It was still intact. If they could reach it, they could escape. She turned to Carter. Can you fly? He raised an eyebrow. Not like you, but I can manage. Scifi nodded. Then we need a plan. Carter smirked. I already have one. Scifi sighed. Of course you do. Carter crouched behind a crate, motioning for her to stay low. He pulled out a small device and tossed it toward the far side of the hangar. A second later. Boom! An explosion erupted across the room. The mercenaries shouted, their attention shifting to the blast. Go! Carter grabbed Scifi's hand and ran. They sprinted across the hangar, weaving between ships and equipment. The distraction worked. The mercenaries were too busy reacting to the explosion to notice them. They reached the transport. Scifi rushed to the controls, her fingers flying over the interface. The ship's engines roared to life. Carter took position at the ramp, firing cover shots at the mercenaries who had finally noticed them. Almost there. Scifi called. Carter kept firing, his movements precise. He wasn't just buying time. He was controlling the battlefield. The engines powered up fully. The ship was ready. Get in, Scifi shouted. Carter fired one last shot, then leaped onto the ramp. The door sealed behind him. Scifi took the controls, her hand steady. The ship lifted off, rising above the hangar floor. Mercenaries fired at them, but their shots bounced harmlessly off the shields. With a final push, Scifi sent the ship rocketing out of the station, into the vastness of space. They were free. She exhaled deeply, gripping the controls. Carter slumped into the co-pilot's seat. Not bad, Princess. Scifi allowed herself a small smile. Not bad yourself, Captain. For the first time since this mission began, she felt something new toward the human soldier beside her. Not annoyance, not frustration, but respect. And maybe something more. But that was a thought for another time. Right now, they had to figure out what came next. Scifi kept her hand steady on the controls as the ship soared away from the station, leaving the chaos behind. The stars stretched before them, endless and calm. But her heart was still racing. The events of the last few hours had changed everything. Beside her, Carter sat in the co-pilot's seat, breathing hard but steady. He glanced at the sensors. No pursuit yet. Scifi nodded. They will come eventually. We need a safe place to regroup. Carter leaned back, rubbing his forehead. Got any friendly ports? Scifi thought for a moment. Yes, there is a neutral outpost nearby. They will not interfere, but they also will not help us. That'll do, Carter said. Set course. She programmed the coordinates, and the ship smoothly adjusted its trajectory. The tension in the cockpit eased, slightly. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence felt heavier than before. Not uncomfortable, but different. Finally, Scifi exhaled. That was reckless. Carter smirked. Which part? She turned to face him. All of it. He chuckled. Worked out, didn't it? Scifi sighed. That is not the point. You take too many risks. Carter shrugged. That's how humans survive. She studied him. His uniform was torn, his arm had a fresh cut, and his face held the exhaustion of battle. Yet he was still calm, still in control. She shook her head. I do not understand your kind. Carter raised an eyebrow. That's so. Scifi folded her arms. You fight without hesitation. You rush into danger. You face death like it means nothing. Carter's smirk faded slightly. It means something. We just don't let it stop us. Scylla watched him closely. Why? Carter was silent for a moment. Then he leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. Because if we stop, we lose. That's just how it is. We don't have the luxury of hesitation. Scylla blinked. She had never thought of it that way. Her people valued caution, strategy, careful diplomacy. Humans moved. They acted first, adjusted later. And yet, here they were, alive. Because of him. She softened her tone. It is different from how my people think. Carter nodded. Yeah, I figured. A pause. Then he smirked. Still, you handled yourself pretty well back there. Scylla tilted her head. Are you complimenting me? He chuckled. Maybe. Scylla felt an unfamiliar warmth rise in her chest. She ignored it. Instead, she changed the subject. What now? Carter exhaled. Depends. Those mercs were after you, which means someone paid them. Someone who doesn't want you alive. Scylla clenched her fists. There are many who wish to disrupt the peace treaty. My presence is a threat to their plans. Then you need to be careful. Carter's voice was firm. Next time, you might not have a trigger-happy human watching your back. Scylla glanced at him. Next time, I will be ready. Carter smirked. That's the spirit, princess. She rolled her eyes but couldn't help the small smile that touched her lips. Silence settled again, but this time, it was not heavy. It was understanding. For the first time, Scylla saw humans differently. They were not just unpredictable, reckless creatures. They were survivors, warriors, and perhaps something more. And for the first time, Carter looked at an alien not as a mission, not as a political figure, but as someone he could respect. As the ship moved toward the distant outpost, one thing was certain. This was only the beginning. The end.